We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles and...
The Kingdom of Aldenmore had not seen an emergency council called before dawn in over 40 years, and when the summons went out that morning, no one in the palace pretended to know why. King Edmund himself had signed the order the night before, in a hand steadier than anyone expected from a monarch who had spent the last 6 months fighting a private and unspoken illness. He had told no one what the meeting concerned, not even his closest secretary, and by the time the great doors of the council chamber opened, the uncertainty itself had become its own kind of dread. Crown Prince Cedric arrived first, still in the clothes he'd slept in, his face drawn with the particular tension of a man who has spent a sleepless night imagining every possible catastrophe. He had feared, briefly, that his father's health had finally broken past the point of concealment. He had feared, too, that some foreign crisis had erupted overnight, the kind that required a monarch's signature before breakfast. What he had not imagined, not once in the long walk from his apartments to the chamber, was that the crisis waiting for him concerned his stepmother. Queen Isolde entered a few minutes later, composed in the way she always was, her posture perfect, her expression giving away nothing. She had been queen consort for 11 years, and in that time she had learned to walk into any room in Aldenmore as though she belonged there, because for 11 years that belonging had never once been seriously questioned. She took her seat beside the king's empty chair without any sense that this particular morning would be different from 100 others. It was that certainty, more than anything else, that made what followed so devastating. King Edmund entered last, and he did not sit down. He carried a single folder, bound in red leather and sealed with the royal crest, and he set it on the table in front of him without opening it right away. The room went silent in the particular way that rooms go silent when everyone present understands, without being told, that something irreversible is about to happen. Edmund looked at his wife for a long moment before he spoke, and those who were present later said his voice, when it finally came, was quieter than they expected, as though he were trying to soften a blow he knew he could not soften. He told her, plainly, that he was withdrawing her style as Her Royal Highness, effective immediately by royal decree. The words landed in the room like something physical. Isolde did not move for several seconds. When she finally spoke, it was not to argue but to ask, simply, whether he had already made up his mind before calling her into the room at all. Edmund answered that he had, and that the decision had not been made lightly, and that he owed her an explanation, though not, he said, in front of the full council. What the wider court would later call an emergency decree was, in its formal language, considerably drier than the rumors that eventually surrounded it. It withdrew the queen consort style from official correspondence, from court circulars, from ceremonial introductions. It did not touch her marriage, her residence, her household, or her personal safety. But titles in Aldenmore had never been merely decorative, and everyone in that room understood that removing 3 words from a woman's name was, in its own quiet way, a public verdict. To understand why Edmund did it, one has to go back 3 nights, to a much smaller and much less formal meeting at Thornfield Castle, the old royal retreat where the family had traditionally gathered to discuss matters of succession planning, the unglamorous, deeply unromantic business of deciding who would act for the crown if the king himself ever became unable to. These meetings happened every few years, always privately, always without ceremony. Isolde had attended them before, always in the role of spouse rather than participant, present but not empowered to shape the documents being discussed. This time something had shifted in her. Edmund's illness, which the public did not yet know about in any detail, had progressed to the point where the family's private physicians had begun using words like unpredictable and episodic in their briefings. Isolde had sat through 3 of those briefings in as many months, watching her husband's hands shake during meetings, watching him lose the thread of conversations he would once have led effortlessly. She had begun, quietly and without telling anyone, to imagine a future in which he simply could not act, and in which she would have no formal role in protecting him or the household they had built together. So when the succession papers were laid out at Thornfield that night, she did something she had never done before. She asked for a clause to be added, a formal, binding provision that would allow her to approve major household decisions if Edmund became temporarily incapacitated. It was not, in her own mind, a grab for power. It was closer to what she would later describe to her stepson as an act of fear. A woman who had watched her husband's decline more closely than anyone else in that room, trying to build herself a place in a plan that had never once accounted for her. Prince Cedric, to his credit, did not respond with anger in the moment. He responded, instead, with the careful, almost gentle firmness of a man who has spent his entire life being trained to protect a system larger than any individual sitting inside it. He told her that no consort, however devoted, however present, however deserving of affection, could be granted executive authority through marriage alone. He said that affection could shape a private household, but it could never become a substitute for constitutional order. It was not, he insisted later, an accusation. It was a boundary. But Isolde heard it as something closer to erasure, and she said so, and the meeting ended without resolution and with considerably more tension than it had begun. What no one anticipated was that Isolde would not let the matter rest there. The following morning, without informing either her husband or stepson, she instructed a member of her household staff to draft a formal version of the clause she had proposed, not as an official act, since she had no authority to make it one, but as a document she intended to raise again, perhaps with different allies, perhaps at a different moment when the king was less guarded. The draft reached Edmund's desk 2 days later, forwarded to him by an aide who had assumed, reasonably, that the king would want to see anything touching the line of succession. Edmund read it twice. He did not, in that first reading, feel anger so much as a kind of cold recognition. He understood immediately what the document represented. Not simply his wife's fear, which he could have forgiven easily, but an attempt, however understandable its motive, to build institutional traction for a claim he had already rejected. It was that act, the continuing of the effort after a clear refusal, rather than the original request itself, that convinced him he needed to draw a line the entire court would understand without ambiguity. He summoned Cedric that same evening and told him to prepare the decree. The confrontation between Edmund and Isolde, once the council chamber had emptied, was far quieter than the rumors that would later circulate among the staff. There were no shouted accusations, no dramatic exits. Isolde asked him, directly, whether he was protecting the crown or simply protecting his son's future at her expense. Edmund answered that he did not see those two things as being in conflict, and that he had never intended the decree as a punishment so much as a correction, an attempt to draw a boundary before uncertainty could turn into genuine institutional confusion. He told her he had given her, over 11 years, dignity, security, and a home. What he could not give her, he said, was the right to redraw the lines of an office that had never belonged to either of them personally, but to the country they both served. Isolde did not accept this easily. She told him that the title had once meant something beyond ceremony to her, that when he had first insisted on granting her the style of Royal Highness, over the objections of several older courtiers who still remembered the circumstances of their marriage, it had felt like the one unambiguous proof that she was not merely tolerated but claimed. Taking it away now, she said, using the same authority that had once been used to protect her, felt less like a constitutional correction and more like a betrayal dressed in careful language. Edmund did not have an answer to that which fully satisfied either of them, and he did not pretend to. The public version of events, once the palace issued its formal statement the following morning, was considerably more bloodless than what had actually happened. It confirmed that the queen consort style had been revised, that her marriage and residence remained unaffected, and it offered no further detail. That vagueness did nothing to slow the speculation. Newspapers ran the story on their front pages. Broadcasters interrupted their morning programs. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates, some sympathetic to Isolde, others convinced she must have done something to deserve it, though almost none of them had any real information to base that judgment on. Cedric became, in the days that followed, an unlikely secondary target of public suspicion. Commentators speculated that he had engineered the crisis to secure his own position ahead of an eventual succession, a theory he could not properly rebut without revealing the private contents of the Thornfield meeting, which the palace had no intention of making public. His silence, meant as restraint, was read by some as guilt. His wife, Princess Alara, urged him privately not to respond to the speculation at all, warning him that any public defense would only make the story look more like a struggle between generations than what it actually was. An old fear, mishandled, that had grown into something neither of the people involved had wanted. It was Isolde herself, in the end, who did the most to calm the story. Through a short statement released by her own office, she confirmed that she accepted the king's decision and affirmed, without qualification, that any authority connected to the throne belonged to the crown prince alone. She did not defend the clause she had proposed. She did not criticize Edmund. The statement was, in its brevity, almost anticlimactic, and that was precisely its power. It denied the public the open family war that half the coverage had been anticipating. 2 weeks later, Edmund and Isolde appeared together at a long-scheduled charitable engagement, the first public appearance either of them had made since the decree. She was introduced, for the first time in 11 years, without the words that had once preceded her name. She did not flinch visibly, though those closest to her said afterward that she had rehearsed hearing it beforehand, alone, so that the moment in public would not catch her by surprise. Edmund, standing beside her, reached briefly for her hand as they walked in together, a gesture with no constitutional weight whatsoever, but one that everyone present understood as a kind of answer to the question the whole country had been asking. The marriage, whatever else had changed, had not ended. Cedric watched the appearance from several steps back, the way he had watched most of the crisis unfold. Present, implicated, but never quite at its center. In the weeks after, he sought out Isolde privately, without his father and without any of the household officials whose presence had shaped every earlier conversation between them. It was not a warm reunion. There was too much history, too much unspoken grief tied up in his own mother's memory, for it to become that easily. But it was honest in a way their earlier exchanges had not been. Isolde told him she had never meant to threaten his position, only to protect herself against a future in which illness might leave her with no formal place at all. Cedric admitted, in turn, that his first instinct had been to read her request as a grab for power, and that it had taken him longer than it should have to consider what fear might look like from where she was standing. They did not arrive at anything so tidy as forgiveness. What they reached instead was a working agreement, quietly negotiated and never announced publicly. She would not raise the question of formal authority again, and he would make sure that whatever household protections she was entitled to, her residence, her charitable patronages, her place beside the king at public events, remained untouched by the dispute. It was not, either of them privately admitted, the outcome either had wanted when the crisis began. But it was one they could both live inside. Edmund's illness, in the months that followed, did not improve, though it did not worsen as quickly as some of the private briefings had once feared. He continued to reign, with Cedric taking on an increasing share of ceremonial duties, a transition the public largely read as ordinary succession planning rather than crisis management, which was, in its own way, exactly what the family had hoped for. Isolde remained beside him at official functions, her name introduced now in the simpler form the decree had established, a small and permanent reminder, for anyone who cared to notice it, of the crisis that had briefly threatened to unmake the household entirely. What the decree ultimately protected, in the end, was not really a title at all. It was a boundary, the difference, as Cedric had tried and failed to explain that first night at Thornfield, between the private devotion of a marriage and the formal machinery of a constitutional order that had to survive any one person's illness, grief, or fear. Isolde lost something real in the process, and no one in the family ever pretended otherwise. But the crown, whatever its cost, remained intact, its lines of authority undisputed, its succession clear. And for a monarchy that had weathered far worse crises with far less grace, that clarity, however painfully bought, was its own kind of survival.